Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to AlMaghrib's YouTube channel. Faith While Black is the series. Make sure that you turn on your notifications and subscribe so that you don't miss an episode.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallim tasliman kathira. Welcome to the final episode of our series, Faith While Black. And of course, we had to have, I've been using the word legend a lot, but we have with us, alhamdulillah, the living legend, Sheikh Abdullah 𝐁𝐤𝐤, Dr. Abdullah 𝐁𝐤𝐤, who is a senior historian, having accomplished a lifetime worth of achievements spanning many continents while enlightening the lives of millions, alhamdulillah. And he's the head of AlMaghrib's Seerah and Islamic History Department. And Dr. Abdullah 𝐁𝐤𝐤 was born in the United States and accepted Islam in Canada in 1970. And he pursued his study of Islam at the Islamic University of Medina in Saudi Arabia, where he graduated and he received an ijazah to teach the Islamic sciences. And he was one of the first two students to do so from the West. So when we look at all of, alhamdulillah, the American and Western students who graduated from the Islamic University of Medina, we understand that Dr. Abdullah 𝐁𝐤𝐤 is one of the first two to ever do it. And so he later completed a master's degree and a doctorate in African history at the University of Toronto in Canada. And his thesis was an analysis of the early life of Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, a great West African scholar, a mujahid and social activist. And Dr. Abdullah 𝐁𝐤𝐤 has visited 63 countries in his life. And he is very active at the Islamic Institute of Toronto, IIT, and is the outreach coordinator with the Canadian Council of Imams. So we are very privileged and happy to have Dr. Abdullah 𝐁𝐤𝐤 with us. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykhna.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the gift of life.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. You know, when I told some of my friends that I'm going to interview Dr. 𝐁𝐤𝐤, they were so excited, and people started telling me, they were like, oh, back in the day, we used to see all of these da'wah pamphlets. He had a series of da'wah pamphlets that we used to see out and used to give out. And they were so, and one of my friends, he told me that, you were a part of his conversion story as well. And so you've been doing this for a very, very long time. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless from you and accept from you.
Ameen. Ameen.
So, Imam, have you, since the days of, the early days, the pioneering days of the da'wah, have you seen the topic of Islam in the Americas grow over the years? Why do you think that is? Your course that you teach with the AlMaghrib Institute, and actually this is the course that we'll be discussing to some degree, deeper roots, the history of Islam in the Americas. Even as an American Muslim, most of the time our concern is only the United States. But you made it a point that you would teach a course on Islam in the Americas, which obviously includes Latin America. Why did you intentionally, deliberately include Islam in the Americas?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah wa ba'd. Yes, this is an interesting question. And to answer it, I need to go back into my own roots, because my family is African American completely in terms of culture. But my mother's mother came from the island of Barbados, which is in the West Indies, Caribbean.
Yes.
And on my father's side, his mother was a part Mohawk of the First Nations. So therefore, within my blood is African blood, native blood, some European blood as well. And so from the early part of my life, I didn't look at myself, as stuck in a particular city or corner or state, but I saw myself more as a child of the world. And so immediately with my own roots, when I think of America, I think of all the lands. And that is the way the conquerors who came over looked at the Americas. As a complete package. And this is part of the expansion of the mind that is happening now, especially with the rise of social media and with people's ability to access information. It's no longer historians who are stuck in a dusty library. Now information is at the hands of even the youth. And it's just a matter of being able to handle this information, to understand what is going on, to get a methodology in handling it, and then make it a reality.
MashaAllah. So do you see Islam's growing in the Americas itself?
Yes, in the past 40 years or so, Islam has been, and I believe still is, the fastest growing religion in the Americas, without a doubt, especially now with Latino people embracing Islam, Native people embracing Islam, along with the African American population that's constantly entering into Islam. There's no doubt that Islam is the fastest growing religion in this part of the world. The question is, what is Islam? Who are Muslims? And what is the relationship with the Americas? And this is really what the whole concept of deeper roots is tackling, to try to answer some of these questions and to give the younger generation direction as to how to deal with the onslaught of propaganda that is against Islam and against African people and Native people as well. So how do we develop a methodology to deal with this? And then start to look at the facts. And when you start to look at the information that comes in, it is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And we found out that some of the African historians in the earlier 20th century, African-American historians who went into the libraries, they were able to access information. It was so overwhelming for them, the amount of lies and distortions, that many of them committed suicide because we couldn't handle the level of distortion and lies. So what Deeper Roots is doing is sort of uncovering, a massive deception that has happened in the educational system and in our culture. It's really sort of opening a door for the students. I won't be able to travel with you or the students through the door because this will probably take, a whole generation.
Yeah.
But at least I can open the door, inshallah.
Beautiful. And when you mention it, I mean, in your course, you talk about, of course, Eurocentrism, and you talk about how, even just the notion, like a lot of the things that we just take as givens, right? Greenwich Standard Time. Well, why is Greenwich, this random section of London, the standard time for the entire world, for example? And when you present information about how it is very logical and in fact proven that Muslims travel to the Americas, they discovered land beyond the known world at that time, and it's written in their books. But at the same time, we might read this and even still we don't want to come to that conclusion because it's so off and so different from our worldview and what we've been indoctrinated.
What's interesting about this study is that the history of the deeper roots, the reality of the Americas, has been hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to go back to that term many times during our talk. Think about it. Hidden in plain sight. What does that mean? That means that we are so brainwashed that there are veils of ignorance which are, covering our eyes. And so there can be a reality right in front of us, but because, our perception is distorted, we're unable to benefit from that information. For instance, the concept of the world itself. Now we say there's a lot of trouble going on in the Middle East. When you say the word Middle East, it means middle from where?
From Europe. Yeah.
For a person living in Syria or Palestine, that's the center of the world.
Yes.
It means middle from Europe, and especially England. If you say the Far East, the Chinese are now struggling with the Americans. It's a battle for the Far East. Far from where? You see, so we use these terminologies without even understanding what we're using. In our minds, North is civilized and South is uncivilized. The developed countries are in the North and the underdeveloped countries are in the South. But if you look at the history of the world, you realize that civilization, humanity came from the south and went north. Civilization as well came from the south and went north. The Europeans, you could say, the last group of human beings to benefit from the collective knowledge of humans from the beginning and make a civilization. There have been many civilizations before this Western construct that we are living in. But what they've done is wipe out the other ones to make you think that everything begins with them. And that is what is called Eurocentrism. And so what I'm trying to develop is another type of centering. It's not Afrocentric, because some people have centered themselves only in Africa.
Yes.
Not Indo-centric. Some people think everything comes from India. It's not Chinese-centric. The Chinese have centered themselves for centuries. I would call it Mecca-centric, which means that we center ourselves with the prophets. We center ourselves with the revelation, and then we look at the rest of the world. So with this concept in mind, we then gather our information and we take down the false construct of Eurocentrism, and we start to give people of other continents and places their contributions without wiping out the Europeans, by the way. We just want to put them in the proper perspective. So it's all about perspective.
But then this wouldn't be a universal perspective, right? Because non-Muslims wouldn't necessarily agree with having a Mecca-centric view of the world.
True, and this course primarily is for Muslims, the Deeper Roots course. I structured it that way. But I also teach this same course to people who are not Muslims. And so when I teach the other way, then I just break down Eurocentrism and deal with, the world, as a body. So I use the term, especially for students, I say we're not studying history, his story, we're studying our story. See the difference in the two?
Absolutely.
So it's not his story anymore.
But I guess you could also say that at the end of the day, there has to be some system that the world is united by, and right now it's the European system. And if the Ummah were to unite in that way, it could very well be the Mecca-centric system that everybody else simply follows. He who has the gold makes the rules, so to speak.
That's right. I mean, we're not going to throw away all of the progress, that has happened in the past 500 years or so.
Yeah.
But what it is to put it in the proper perspective. And when we do that, we understand that European civilization itself is not an island. It didn't start by itself, but the Europeans were skillfully able to benefit from the cultures and civilizations of people all around the world. Up until now, if you go to Silicon Valley in California, you will see that many of the people are from the so-called third world countries.
Absolutely.
You look at doctors, in Houston, in Texas, and all around America, you see many of them are from India and Pakistan and, Muslim countries.
The United States has no problem. They call it the genius visa, the H-1B visa. Give me all of your brightest minds. And it's a wonderful thing. It's a great thing that the United States and Western countries in general are willing to do.
That's right. And they're actually following our example, because I bring out, in the beginning of the Deeper Roots course, what happened in the golden age of Islam. And it was, when Muslims, left after the time of the Prophet ﷺ and encountered civilizations, they didn't destroy the information. They began to assimilate it. And it was during the Abbasid period, under the Khalifa Ma'mun, you'll see the pinnacle coming in around the 10th century, 11th century. And then you'll see Muslims rising to a height. And what Ma'mun actually did was he formed what is called Bayt al-Hikmah, which was the house of wisdom. And he would give people a weight in gold for any book that he didn't read or that they weren't aware of. So scholars came to Baghdad, not just Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, Jewish scholars, all types came to Baghdad, and they formed what you could call the first world think tank. See, it's this concept that Harvard University uses when it gives its scholarships and stipends to scholars and brings them in, when MIT brings in Massachusetts Institute of Technology, brings in engineers from around the world. So we actually started this, but we didn't do it in the sense of exploiting people. We were just thirsty for this knowledge, and we took the knowledge and put it into an Islamic way of looking at things, connecting it with the creator of the heavens and the earth, not separating secular from sacred knowledge. And Allah blessed us to be able to expand to the point where we were the most powerful people on earth.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you're enjoying the Faith While Black Conversations. It's a series sponsored by Deeper Roots, the History of Islam in Americas, taught by Dr. Abdullah Hakim 𝐻𝐿. You can find out more about the course at www.almaghrib.online. Now back to the program.
You know, when you talk about the separating of secular and sacred knowledge, I remember when I was in 5th grade, I had a friend of mine, and I went to an American school in Sudan when I was in 5th grade. And so my friend, he got transferred from the American school and he went to a regular Sudanese school. His dad wanted him to really be absorbed in Arabic, and he was like, you know what? And so I asked him how, got back with him a couple of months into the semester and said, how was school? And he said, he was like, I don't know what's going on. They'll be talking about waves in science class, and then they'll say, and this is how Allah Azza wa Jal said this and this and this, and the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said this and this and this. And he's like, what's that got to do with science, right? And so that secularism, when we were kids at the time, we had no idea, but it was just such a distinction that was already being drawn for us, that science is science and religion has nothing to do with these concepts. And so Islamic tradition and the Muslim world has always been that they're not separate spheres, but they are truths.
That's right. And it is that integrated concept of looking at the world which helps us to then approach history. So when we look at the Americas, we have to look at America before Columbus. This is why with the course Deeper Roots doesn't begin with African slaves and political prisoners, but what it begins with is the actual formation of the Americas, the indigenous people. Because in order to understand this story, we have to understand all of the waves that came in. And before that, we need to understand what was happening in the Americas before us. And I would consider this, and many historians consider what happened in the Americas as probably the greatest cover-up in the history of humanity. I don't know.
The greatest cover-up from what aspect?
From the aspect of what was in the Americas, who the people were, what happened, and what is the reality that we think about today. For instance, when you think about America today, ancient America, they talk about Indians. So they say there's a bunch of Indians running around, they're savages, running around, and there's really not much happening, and then the European culture came and established, a great society. The reality is there were over 73 million people living in the Americas. Think about this, 73 million. And in those days, that's a big number.
Absolutely.
Also, 1/2 of the products of the world actually originated in the Americas. Potatoes, what would Ireland and Europe be without potatoes? They were dying in a famine, potatoes saved them. Tomatoes started in the Americas. The melons, corn, what would Africa be in much of the world without corn? Corn started in the Americas, in Mexico area. And there's a whole list, 1/2 of the world products started in the Americas and were then exported to other parts of the world. But in our minds, potatoes is a European plant. Corn is, African or Asian. And so it's a cover-up. The reality of the contributions of the people in this part of the world were totally wiped out. to the point where you think they were just savages. They did nothing. And it's hidden in plain sight because people will travel to Mexico and they see huge pyramids. I went there myself. I went to Belize and Guatemala, and I found pyramids the size of the pyramids that you find in northern Sudan or you find in Egypt along the Nile.
Yes.
As big, almost as big as those. Where did they come from? And these pyramids were there when Ferdinand Columbus, the son of Christopher, reached the mainland, because Christopher never actually reached the mainland. He was only on the islands. But when his son went into Mexico, he found hanging gardens, pyramids. The Mayan calendar, is as good as any other calendar in the world. An amazing civilization. It's all covered up. So I think there are a bunch of naked Indians running around killing each other who had to be civilized. You see, so that is the story.
Did they have a lot of, did they have written, a lot of written literature, the Native Americans?
They did to a certain extent. One of the worst crimes that the Spanish conquistadors, the mercenary conquerors, Cortez, when he came into Mexico, Pizarro, when he went into Peru, one of the worst things the Spanish did was they burnt every single book or written thing they could find.
Wow.
They started doing this when they conquered Muslims in Spain.
Yes.
Because remember, Muslims had been in Al-Andalus for almost 800 years. And there were millions of books. Cordoba was the center of the world. In the year 1000, it was the most populated city in the world. And so when the Spanish came down and through the weakness of the Muslims and started conquering Spain and Portugal, they burnt every single book they could find. Of course, first they would translate into their own language what they needed, right?
Yes.
And if they didn't need, they would burn it. And so they carried the same concept to the Americas. That's the reason why it's difficult to find documents, because they literally burnt every single thing they could find. Okay, so this is part of the tragedy of the Americas.
So, Dr. Abdullah Hakim, quick, what made you study all of this? Like, were you always going to be a historian and interest in Islam took you to Medina, for example, or did you would think like a sheikh, okay, then they're going to just do da'wah and maybe specialize more in Sharia and then some more in Sharia, right? But then you went the historian route. What made you do that?
Well, actually, I wouldn't consider myself a historian in the sense that people think historians are old men in these dried up universities.
Okay.
I would call myself an investigative journalist in a sense.
Allahu Akbar, watch out.
Right. I'm an investigator.
Okay.
And really from a young age, I began to investigate my own family roots, what was happening around. I used to read National Geographic when I was really young. I wanted to travel. And so that investigation began when I was very young. Then I went into my roots as an African American and realized there were great civilizations in West Africa. I started studying those. Then Allah blessed me, when I left the US and came to Canada, I embraced Islam. That opened up another world, for me, meeting people from different parts of the world. And then I ended up in Medina. And after completing my studies, and from the College of Dawah, Kulliyat Dawah wa Usul ad-Din, I felt that my main task was to deliver the message to the people of the Americas or the West. That I see as my mission. And when I went into the field, I recognized, if you had a program on Islam, the misunderstood religion, or what is Islam, only a few people would come to the program.
Yes.
If you had a program, roots, African history, what do you know about your family? And you publicize this, in the African community, and of course the Afro community is the most fertile community for the spread of Islam in the West. Everybody comes, the place is crowded.
Yeah.
So I realized that now this convergence of my passion for history with the strategic use of history as a means of reaching people who would otherwise not go near Islam because they're brainwashed into thinking that Muslims are fundamentalists and Islamists and terrorists. Now they will see through their roots that Islam was the most powerful way of life in West Africa and in much of the African continent, and then they'll expand to the rest of the world. So alhamdulillah, by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I was able to use my passion in the field of da'wah. And it is through this that I was able to travel around the Americas. And then I went to Cape Town, South Africa, and I founded the Discover Islam Center. And we traveled around to the frontline states. I went to 20 African countries, and we would go right into the capital. We would have programs for the non-Muslims. And, you know, much of the beginning of the program is dealing with history. For instance, I would go to Botswana, which is in South Africa.
So you were in South Africa for 10 years?
10 years, right, Cape Town.
Okay.
And I traveled to every province in South Africa. And I also traveled to my Discover Islam Center. We went to Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, Lesotho, Swaziland, all of the frontline states of the South. And as we would go to the places, we would go to the city hall, we would go to the universities, and we're dealing with roots. We're dealing with history. And we show the convergence. And I would take them back to the first hijrah when the Prophet ﷺ and sent his companions where? Into Africa.
Yes.
Not as conquerors or slave traders.
As refugees.
As refugees.
Yes.
Totally changes the discourse. You see? So this is the way that Allah made it easy, to use history, as a means of getting across the message. Now I'm realizing that with the convergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic recession and the rise of racism or the exposing of racism, it is common now on the ground for Muslims and non-Muslims to want to know the history of the West, and in particular the history of America. People are pulling down statues. People are trying to change history books. Why would you pull down a statue of a president? Why are you angry with the president? When you go into the history, you find that President Thomas Jefferson, who was, one of the founding fathers of America, and he did a lot for the 13 states, there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, he had slaves. And it is known that he was really cruel to his slaves. And when he died, or when he was about to die, he wrote his will, and he said in the will, don't free the slaves. So this is a contradiction that is coming up now, and people are realizing that the true history of America and the West has been hidden in plain sight.
Do you, that brings up another question, because these individuals, all of them, these, founding fathers or great men or what have you, they were trying to protect that statue of Winston Churchill in London, that huge, I don't know where it is, but I've seen it. These individuals, when it comes to the serving of their people, they're looked at as, and when I say their people, I mean the people who look like them, not necessarily all of the constituents of their republic, but they were great. I mean, I don't know if you can deny Winston Churchill, like when you read the Nazi advance and his, stance with Britain and his speeches and all of that type of stuff. But at the same time, as someone who's Sudanese, when I go to the statue of Winston Churchill, I'm like, the things that he did in Sudan but for his people, like he served his, and so that dichotomy, do you see that as being something that's worthy of respect, or does their atrocity, in your view, completely outweigh any greatness that they might have had?
Well, what I would say in this case is that, we need to put things in proper perspective. So in other words, you don't throw everything out. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You try to put the individual in the right perspective, in the sense that he was a great defender of his people, but he was also he exploited other people as well. Christopher Columbus, for the Spanish, he was opening up a way to what they called the New World. And it was a new world for them. They were looking for gold. And what I found out is that when Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain, when they took over Granada, when Granada in Spain, Al-Andalus, was surrendered in 1492, and that's an important date, right? 1492. Abu Abdullah, who was the leader of the Muslims in Granada, when they surrendered, when Abu Abdullah surrendered, Christopher Columbus was at the door. And once the surrender was done, he then went to the king and queen and said, I can get you gold. And so Columbus, for his own people, was opening things up. But for the people of the Americas, he was a conqueror, he was a vicious mercenary, and he began a terrible genocide that we're still suffering from today. So tell both sides of the story. That's what I'm saying.
And let people make their decisions.
That's right.
Absolutely. So how has learning all of this history benefited you personally? How has it benefited you as far as your outlook on life? How has it benefited you professionally?
Well, for me personally, it has answered some of the questions of my own roots and family. And I'm still searching in my family's ancestry.
How has knowing your roots and your family helped you? What did that give you?
When a person doesn't know their history, they're actually lost in the present. And this is one of the worst things that happened with the Atlantic slave trade, is that the history and culture and the memory of African Americans was taken away. And this is very destructive. I remember, to show you another example, Bosnia. When the Serbians were destroying Bosnia, I remember distinctly that they were first hitting libraries, museums, schools. And so I asked the question, why would they destroy that? The answer was, when you wipe out the library, the school, the museum, you are destroying the memory of the people. And when you destroy the memory of the people, then you can subjugate their minds. So that person is a real slave. And even if you give independence to the slaves, you say it's abolished, slavery is abolished. If their mind is still enslaved, then they're still slaves. And this is what happened in the Americas. And that's why people talk about slavery, and they say the slaves were freed. They used the name Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But the reality was the slaves were not officially free till 1865 with the 13th Amendment. And Lincoln wasn't that much involved in freeing the slaves. He wanted to unite the North and the South. That was the main reason for the Civil War. Okay, that the slaves, that is in the background, because that was the means of production, for the South. But who controls it? And so once slavery is abolished, they still needed cheap labor. So they had to get a way to make African Americans work, right? And so this is where, in the so-called Reconstruction, they're developing the country, but they start to have all these Jim Crow laws, and people are put in jail. And when you're put in jail, then in a sense you're a slave. So you can switch your factories to the prisons and make them, so this is part of the cover-up. So in order to understand that part of the cover-up, and inshallah that's going to be the next part of our series. This is the first Deeper Roots series. But inshallah,
okay,
we're working on another part.
Allahu Akbar. This is good news.
In order to understand that second part, which goes up into the present, you need to understand the background of this.
Okay.
So what Deeper Roots does, it shows you the background. It shows you the methodology that was used to enslave people. It shows you how it was carried out. And then it tears off the cover and then tells our history, Deeper Roots. So it's not just roots like Alex Haley's book, right? I call it Deeper Roots. I want to go deeper now. And when you start to go deeper, you will see the presence of Muslims in all of these waves. And this is what we're bringing out in this course, not only to show people about the waves that came, but also to show that Muslims were actually a very integral part of these waves. And this is very important today for young Muslims who are coming up in a world where people are saying, you Muslims are foreigners, you just came off the boat, you know, go home to your country, you're not part of this country. We need to understand, our community needs to understand that we have been a part of this country from before the inception of the country. African American Muslims know this already. And that is the basis of our communities that have been set up. But other Muslims who have come in from different parts of the world and their children now being raised here do not understand the history. They don't understand the important role that they have been playing in the growth and the building of the nations that we are living in this part of the world. So Deeper Roots is trying to open up the door, give a methodology, and then start to give some information so that people can start to process the information.
So you mentioned the erasing of history during during the slavery period. Do you feel like that's happening also amongst young people in the sense that because they don't know their history, do you see them not being able to really grapple with the issues of the present as a result of not knowing history?
Yes, this is a very serious issue, because in the 60s, we also had a rebellion. And if you go back to the 1930s, there was another big major rebellion that happened in the Americas as well. And so what was different about the 60s, it was not just anarchy and chaos and in the streets and demonstrating. It was more of a cultural awareness revolution. And that was that people were now seeking their roots. They were seeking their identity to try to understand, you know, where they had come from, to make that connection with the African continent, you know, and to sort of a pan-African, that was a terminology coming out the 60s, pan-African concept. If you go back to Malcolm X's teachings, 𝐁𝐥𝐻𝐤, you'll see at the end of his life, he was talking about, you know, the uniting African people throughout the world. So he said that was the expansion. But what happened was there was a reaction from the powers to be. Drugs poured into the community, the war on terror, gangster rap, instead of having conscious music, because, you know, if you go to the first rappers, you have to go to New York City and, you know, the last poets. This was like stand-up conscious music, criticizing the system. Gil Scott-Heron, right? This is what you have to go back into. But what they did was they chased down the conscious rappers, you know, and drove them out the country. Drugs poured into our community, and then they replaced it with gangster rap. And so the whole move in the younger generation is more of like I, me, selfie. Now we're involved in selfies all the time. So we become selfish. Instead of thinking of our people, our lands, it becomes more of myself. You see? So a person who thinks about themselves only.
But that's everybody, isn't it? It's not just, for example, Black people. That's American individualism. That's part of the reason why we haven't been able to resolve this coronavirus business, is because everybody's worried about their individual freedom as opposed to that collectivism that, you know, Europeans, for example, feel.
I agree. And that may be one of the biggest causes, you know, for this pandemic and this chaos that's happening in America. But what I'm talking about is within the African community itself, right? Amongst the activists. If the activists do not connect themselves with their roots, if they do not have a way of life to get them out of this, to replace, then all they're doing is making a circle. And all they're doing is they'll end up in a big chaos, running in the streets, and confusion. And so this is why the concept of the roots, you know, the concept of expansion of the mind, you know, is so important for people who are thinking about revolutionary change.
How important has your travel been to you in opening up the mind? You know, a large percentage of Americans don't have a passport. Europeans do a lot better. Canadians do a lot better. But how important has been visiting 63 countries?
Travel opens up the mind. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us in the Quran, that travel in the land. See what happened to those who came before you. And I had this thirst to travel. And, you know, as the philosophers would say, if you really want to understand what an orange is or a mango is, don't just look at it, bite it. Get one and bite it. When you travel to Europe and understand what Europe is, then the veils of of this European supremacy will come off your eyes. When you travel to Africa, when you travel to China, when you travel to the Americas and you realize how big the world is, right? And how similar human beings are, you know, and how many things have happened in history. It's like mind expansion. You know, in the 60s, many people wanted to expand their minds. So Timothy Leary, a scientist, he said, well, I'll make it easy for you. Instead of traveling and going to a guru on a mountain in Tibet, take this pill, which is called LSD, lysergic acid. So you can
and is that why they call it a trip?
Right. So you can go on a trip. So you don't have to pay the money and get diarrhea.
Ajib, we're learning a lot from you today.
That's right. You can sit in your room, put on some Indian music,
Yeah.
you know, and then you travel to India. Right?
Yeah.
But that is a false construct, because when you come down from the pill, it has burnt off, you know, half your brain cells, right? And possibly you're also addicted. So to really get an understanding of India, travel to India. So travel is crucial. Also learning languages, learning foreign languages. One of the great skills of African people, or one of the uniquenesses of Africa, is that you'll find in the African marketplace so many different languages. And find people who have the ability to speak different languages. And when you speak another language, you learn the body language of the people. You learn something of their history because it's in their language, right? So you're actually learning other cultures when you learn other languages. So this is really important for young people. You know, don't get stuck. Expand your mind, travel, learn languages as much as you can.
What's been the favorite place you've ever been to?
Well, for me, of course, I lived in Medina, and I...
Okay, other than Medina, because Medina is Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, you know,
right.
Those are the three. Okay.
But for me, as a historian, to be honest with you, there was two places in particular, and I'm not talking about Mecca or Medina, because seeing the Kaaba was a mind blower for me for the first time. But outside of that, when I went to Egypt and I stood in front of the Great Pyramid of Giza, I was awestruck.
Yep.
Not just because of the size of it, but because I had studied the history and I realized Black African people built this. It was not a light-skinned person looking like Elizabeth Taylor and Mediterranean. They were Black Nubian people who built the pyramid.
Yeah.
And I was shocked because I realized how much power African people had. And to build a structure like this with 2,300,000 blocks of granite, some of them weighing 20 tons, you have had to have had a civilization stretching back a few thousand years in order to get that knowledge to put the pyramid together. And that opened up my mind because I realized the cover-up as far as African history was concerned.
Okay, so Dr. Quick, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The second place, to bring it up to more modern day, the second place that blew my mind was Istanbul, Turkey. When I went to Istanbul and I stood in front of the Blue Mosque, and I went to the Topkapi and I saw what the level the Ottomans had reached, I was amazed at the level of authority that Muslims had in this world. So these two places really shocked me in terms of, places, that I was just awestruck as a historian.
So this is a quick tangent, but you mentioned that Black Nubians had built the pyramids. I had went to Egypt, and I also was amazed when I went to see the pyramid, but not familiar with the history. When you say Black Nubians, I just kind of imagine that the Egyptians then look like the Egyptians now.
Naturally, because people are very superficial and they will judge based upon what they see.
Okay.
You have to realize that Egypt has been a crossroads for thousands of years.
Yes.
The present day Egyptians have not only the original African blood, but they also have Persian blood. They have Greek, Roman, Arab, Turkish, all types of blood flowing through their veins. But when you look at it as a historian, you have to follow the Nile to its source, because the Nile does not flow from north to south, as you would think when you look at the map, right? It flows south-north.
Yes.
Because the mountains are in Uganda and in Kenya and in Ethiopia, and this is the source of the Nile, and the civilization as well. So when you go back to the original founding of Egypt, what we know as Egypt in 3200 BC, when Upper and Lower Egypt was founded by Menes, these were basically African people, who united themselves. And it's during that, what they called the old kingdom. It's the old dynasty. I'm going back to 3000 BC. It is during that time, there were no foreign nations that came into this area. Okay? And right after that, the step pyramid is built. And then about 1,000 years later, then you have the Great Pyramid of Giza. No major incursions have been made. The Greeks—
There's no Romans or Persians or Greeks or anybody up until this point.
Didn't start until around 800 BC. Just think about that. The Greek civilization did not even start until 1,000 years or so after the Great Pyramid was built. So that's part of the cover-up that was used. And so what they will do is that they will say, oh no, aliens built it. So now they say aliens flew down from Mars, built
that is offensive now that you mention it. Yeah, that's— you'd rather aliens built it than Africans.
Right, because if you say Africans built it, then your whole historical flow has to be changed. History came from the Africans and went to the Europeans and to other parts of the world. Similarly, if you say Columbus discovered America, then you are changing the history. If you say what I would say, Columbus was discovered in 1492 because he was lost and he bumped into America on his way to India, and he called the people Indians, and we're still trying to unwind this Indian thing, right, with Washington Redskins and Cleveland Indians. Up until today, we're still dealing with this lie, right, that was on the native people of this part of the world. So the deconstruction, that is what is called deconstructing history. Take it apart and then reconstruct it in a more objective way. So you include history, that includes the Europeans, by the way, but you put them in the proper perspective along with the earlier nations that came before them.
You just make it more balanced and you give everybody their due right and their due weight.
That's right.
So what advice would you have for folks who want to study? What's what tools would you tell them to do? What skills would you tell them to develop? What advice would you have for them?
First, there needs to be mind expansion. And we have to understand the concept of Eurocentrism. And we also have to understand the tribal type of history that we were all taught. If you came from Pakistan, they'll teach you the history of Pakistan. If you came from, Egypt, Egypt, whatever it is. So we have to expand our minds, right, to include the whole human family now. Okay? And then we have to take apart Eurocentrism. That's a really important concept. And there's one author in particular, I mentioned him in the book, Dr. Ali Mazrui, who was a great Kenyan scholar. And for instance, he has a book, Africa, A Triple Heritage. And I've mentioned his name within our texts. But Ali Mazrui was one of the people who was able to break down Eurocentrism and show it clearly, and then to bring in, the right perspective. So it begins with perspective and methodology. And those of you who are really serious about this, we need to understand historical methodology. This is what I call in my course, usul al-tarikh. Usul al-tarikh. So this is not usul al-fiqh, right? For those fiqhi people. No, this is just the foundations of history. So your methodology. And that is where you need to be able to look at the world, number one, the way we used to look at the world. If you look at the Muslim maps, they're like upside down, right?
Yeah.
So you got to realize our perspective was different. So you got to study perspectives, gain historical tools, and then travel and learn languages. You'll have to learn some foreign languages. If you don't know Arabic, you have to learn Arabic. It is crucial. Not only, to understand the Quran and the Hadith, in our texts, but it is crucial to understand history. And I was shocked to find, as an African American, that the pre-colonial West African history was mainly written in Arabic. So it was my Arabic, really, which enabled me to enter the university on a master's level and PhD level, because the professor in the university said to me, I have never seen an African American who speaks Arabic and is interested in African history. Come into my department, man. Because normally they would not take a mutawa from Medina, who just, learned a few subjects in Saudi Arabia into the department of the University of Toronto, right? This is the strongest history department maybe in Canada.
MashaAllah.
They would not take you in. But my interest and my passion in this, and when one of the professors saw me and he realized, this is not an average person here, because the professors were having problems with the documents. When they traveled into West Africa and even the Sudan and other places, they needed a local interpreter to interpret the documents. Then they put it into French and into English and European languages. I'm sitting in front of them with English as my first language, but Arabic as my second language, completely fluent.
Yeah.
Right. So now I can go into the documents written by the African historians and scholars, and I can think the way their mind used to think. Right. So this is why I was able to overcome a lot of the hurdles that stops people from getting into history departments. The point of what I'm saying, though, is that Arabic is essential, and based upon which part of the world that you want to study, you need to go into their languages. If you're going to study African history, you need to understand West Africa, for instance, Hausa. You need to understand the Hausa language, the Fula language. There are a number of West African languages. If you're going to go into the Middle East, you will need to study Turkish as a language. If you're going to go into the Far East, the local languages. Okay, so language is very important as well. And then you need to be in touch with historians, somebody who you can trust. If there's somebody who you can trust as a historian, give you advice, because advice is very, very important. And I can say for me, in West African history, my mentor, Dr. 𝐁𝐤𝐻𝐿, rahimahullah, who was a Sudanese, who was living in Nigeria, and he became one of the leading scholars in understanding the great 18th, 19th century scholars of West Africa, Dr. 𝐷𝐻𝐻𝐿. He took me under his personal care and showed me the way in order to be able to produce, a thesis that could rival any of the work that the people are doing. And so, having somebody like him as an advisor was very, very important thing, to have somebody that you can trust.
You reminded me, your thesis was on Sheikh Uthman Danfodio, rahimahullah. And I would wish that's another like hero of the Muslim world who is swept under the rug. People don't know him. People don't know about him. Is there going to be a series or a course or something coming from Dr. Abdullah Hakim quick about Sheikh Uthman Danfodio?
Yes, I recently produced with Buna Muhammad the history of Islam in East Africa. It's a 4-part series, and it'll be on my YouTube channel, and Araha, which is a Somali relief group, they publicized it. Thousands of people saw it. And now I'm negotiating with Brother Ma'moon, to put it, into a form that could be eventually used by AlMaghrib, inshallah.
But is Uthman Danfodio featured in that?
Yes. So what it would be is to show the movement of Islam into North Africa and then down into West Africa, how it entered, and then to show the different movements that happened in West Africa, and then to focus on Sheikh Uthman Danfodio. Because for me, he was a person who combined different movements. That is his greatness. And so, inshallah, this is in the pipeline. Some years ago, I think it was about 15 years ago, I did a series in the UK with one of the television stations, and people are still talking about that series that I did, in the UK. And so I want to revive this now in the present technology that we have, and to bring out some interesting information, inshallah.
I like to say that we're an ummah filled with heroes without storytellers, right? And so we really need these storytellers, these filmmakers like Buna Muhammad, like Mahmoud, to bring these stories to life for the masses. We're filled with them, mashallah. Right. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect and preserve. So what advice would you have for people who want to learn history for a particular sake, which is the sake of activism? So, we're obviously, the world is saying, I can't breathe right now. And we have a lot of people with a lot of energy who want to do things. How important is history in allowing them to chart the path forward?
Well, we have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us in Surah Yusuf, verse 111, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ إِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, that in their stories, in their qasas, there is wisdom, there are lessons for those who would reflect. Ibratun li ulul albab. So, in other words, the Quran itself, when you look at it objectively, and this is what a lot of present-day Islamic studies courses lack, the Quran itself is 1/3 history. Why do I say that? Because it's 1/3 qasas. These are the parables and the stories that have been given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's not given to us as a nice entertainment. It's given to us as ibrah, as lessons, as gems of wisdom. For who? Li'ulul albab, for those who reflect. So in other words, we study history in order to gain wisdom. For example, in the physical world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has certain, you could say, rules. What goes up comes down. Water at a certain temperature freezes. And these are fixed qawaid, you could say, the rules of the universe. And scientists study these rules in order to give you biology, chemistry, and all the different physical sciences. In history, there are also rules. There are also set rules we call sunnatullah. It is the way of Allah in history. there are certain patterns that shows the rise of civilization and the fall of civilization. And so if you go into history with this methodology, you can actually see how people were able to rise up, benefit their lives, and you will see when people became corrupted and when their civilization fell down. So in other words, we are not studying history for history's sake. We are studying it in order to gain wisdom of the past, to be able to function properly in the present, and then project to the future. A person who does not know his history is lost in the present, and they cannot project into the future.
So, coming through to the history now, let me just transition with you to, our Muslim community, our audience. There's been a lot of, are you hopeful with regards to all of the energy that you're seeing in the community right now? There's a lot of energy towards being involved in, social change and pushing for more, pushing for equality, basically, with a lot of conversations happening about Blackness in the Muslim community, Black Experience series like this, for example, being done. Particularly, do you feel like our imams and leadership, how important do you feel it is for them to be educated about Black culture and Black history in the United States, or in the Americas? Let's make it more general.
Yes, I think it's crucial for our leaders in order to be able to function on the ground, because the whole concept of the masjid itself, when people were coming in waves, of course, there were already African-American masjids here for over 100 years. And then there were Bosnians and Ottoman people who came in a long time ago. But in the recent waves from the 60s, we'll say, when the majority of the Islamic centers were built, the masjids became cocoons. It's a way to hide yourself from the other society. So you go to work, you go to school, and then you go to Jummah and you enter into Pakistan or Mogadishu, or you enter into Khartoum, whatever masjid you come in. It's like a nice, right? But
that's a nice cultural center.
Right, but now, like a butterfly, that worm turned into a butterfly, it's got to come out the cocoon. Okay.
Yeah.
So now our masjids, because of technology and because of the new change in society, we're transparent. You can't close the masjid because technology is watching you anyway. And so the masjid is supposed to be transparent. We're supposed to come out of ourselves. But if the imam who's leading, the masjid only knows history that goes back, 500 years, and then he's pretty good. But, he doesn't know what's going on in the street outside the masjid, is a huge demonstration. People are dying, and he's inside the masjid giving the khutbah, and he's talking about ahkam al-wudu. How do you make wudu?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very important to know how to make wudu, but people are dying outside your building, right?
Yeah.
Not the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because his khutbah was described, he would talk as though there was an army waiting in a mountain right in back.
Yeah.
It was very much in what you call fiqh al-waqi', and the understanding of reality of the present. I was recently in a meeting with the Canadian Council of Imams, and in front of a huge amount of imams, 45 imams or so, they said, Abdullah, Hakim, tell us about racism. Tell us, what's happening. And so I gave, I was forced to give them a condensed version, of slavery, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, not only in the United States and Canada as well, because Canadians had slaves, right? Racism in Canada as well, right?
Yeah.
And then said, okay, Abdullah Hakim, you have to give us a course. So I'm working now, on a special course for the imams, so they can all come in the building and not feel like they're embarrassed because they don't know something, right? And then, interactive, and get them involved, to understand, so their khutbahs and their understanding can be on time with what's happening in the streets, and especially with the younger generation.
Excellent. So you just mentioned racism. Canadians have racism as well. The word racism, not only is it Canada, but we also hear about Muslim societies being racist. And when we present Islam as, the solution to racism, well, the pushback that you get is, well, Muslim societies are racist as well. You lived in the Muslim world. What can you say about Muslims being racist?
Right. Okay. First thing, we have to understand what racism is. This is a topic in itself, but I'll be very concise. There's three parts to racism. Number one, ideology. The real racism is the ideology that the people believe historically, culturally, they are superior. The ideology feeds the second part, which is racist behavior. And that is where you start calling people names and kicking them around and acting arrogant. The third part is what is called institutionalized racism. And that is where the race becomes part of the society itself, and it determines your upward mobility. Probably the most ancient form of institutionalized racism was the caste system of India. And that is where you have the Brahmin caste and all the different castes. If you go down to the untouchable class in India, you'll find they were mostly dark-skinned people. So the lighter you were, generally, in a sense, the higher caste, that you were. And
so then, Dr. Abdullah, is this a? I mean, that must have preceded Eurocentrism, right? This lightness versus darkness, and so was darkness always vilified? Was there ever a time when darkness was considered to be beautiful by people?
No, this is, you see, these are just period. This is a group of people who came from the north. The Brahmins are people, many historians say they came from Russia or from Germany, and there was a drought, and they colonized northern India. So they used this as a construct in order to control the darker skinned people in India itself, the Dravidian people, who are the Tamils. But for thousands of years, darker skinned people were the leaders of the world. I'll give you an example. When I read some of the ancient Greek historians, and they were not racist. And they said, we got our civilization from the Egyptians. And they were dark-skinned people with woolly hair. That's what they said. So they were not racist. They said our civilization came from them.
Yeah.
Which is reality. So for a long time, dark-skinned people were actually, superior. And if you look in Arabic and look in many languages, Aswad itself, has something to do with mastery and power. So if you say Yasud, that they rule over a place. The Sayyid, so black stone, right? The Prophet ﷺ wearing black turban when he entered, Mecca, Fatu Mecca. So black is not necessarily a negative thing.
Okay.
But it has just been manipulated by people.
I see.
In order to gain mastery over the minds. So what the Europeans did was they manipulated this concept, Aryan concept, right, coming from the Brahmins. They manipulated it in order to justify slavery and to build themselves.
So to come back to these are the three aspects of racism: institutionalized racism.
Right. So this is an important point now. So this is racism. So if you look at America, you will see there's an ideology of white supremacy, right? And then there's calling the N-word and other things like that. And then there's institutionalized racism, where you see black people are kept out of certain positions and, put in prison and different things. So it's institutionalized, okay? What happens in the masjids, now I'm not talking about the Muslim world. This is another topic. What happens in the community here is that when Muslims are confronted with this, they will say, Islam has no racism. There's no racism in Islam. And that's correct, because in Islam, there is no racism. But amongst Muslims, it's not racism in the same way as white supremacy. It is what I call structural prejudice. And I'm putting out a talk right now. It's going to hit YouTube. You're going to see the trailer for this at 2 o'clock today.
Okay.
It's going to be a massive production. That's,
MashaAllah.
Keep your eyes and ears open for this.
Okay.
And it's called Between Systemic Racism and Structural Prejudice: The Dilemma of African Muslims or Black Muslims in the African Diaspora. So what it is that Muslims in our masjids, we don't have racism like white supremacy, but we do have prejudice and bias.
So do you believe that it's important that we don't use the term racism for what you're calling bias and discrimination?
Yeah, I mean,
prejudice.
In some parts of the Muslim world, you could call it racism, where actually one group of people, feels they're superior to another. It is actually deteriorated to that point. But in our masjids and Islamic centers, for the most part, it's not racism like that, because Islam is our ideology. But a type of bias and prejudice comes in. For instance, when a Black brother accepts Islam and he comes in the masjid, people hug him and everything like that. Now, what can this brother do? Okay, what should we name the brother? Why don't we call him Bilal? Right? And what do you think the brother can do? Oh, brother, can you call the adhan?
Yep.
Because Afro-Americans have really nice voices, right? You guys are good singers.
Yeah.
Or do security, because you got strong bodies, right? That's stereotyping and prejudice and bias. That person, although—
Is it though? What if he does have a nice voice? And what if he is 6'3" and 300 pounds?
But he might be a nuclear physicist at the same time.
Okay.
So what prejudice does is you prejudge the person. And so you say he must be a good singer and a good security person or dancer. He couldn't be a nuclear physicist, right? Whereas if a European accepts Islam, a white person comes in, then immediately they will say, what should we name him? Let's name him Suhaib, and what should Suhaib do? This is all respect to my brother Suhaib, he's one of my beloved.
I didn't even realize that. That's funny.
What do? And Suhaib is totally different, by the way.
Yeah.
But, okay, I'll use another name. Let's call him Zaid.
Okay.
So Zaid, he's a white Muslim. Why don't we make him a teacher in the school? Why don't we put him on the board of directors? Because you prejudge him. This guy may be a hillbilly, with a 3rd grade education.
Yeah.
Right? But you put him on the board of directors because he's white. That is prejudgment and bias. And a person who's an African American, who's trained in Islamic studies, he has to be twice as good as a white American before he gets to lead salat or to give a lecture, in a conference.
And I'm sure you've seen this many times.
I've gone through this, to the point where when I was leading the Jami Mosque with 1,000 people, the word was going around that I'm actually a Palestinian, because there's a tribe in Palestine called Quick.
MashaAllah.
I think it's a Turkish word, kaf, wow, ya, kaf, right?
Okay.
There's no way this guy can be an African American, right?
Oh.
There's no way that he's speaking Arabic like this, and he can't.
Yeah.
That's not racism, because Islam won't let you be a racist, but it is prejudice, stereotyping, and bias, which can be very hurtful, by the way.
Absolutely.
And also racist words, behavior. We have that. In Arabic, they use the word abd.
Yeah.
They call Black people slaves. The Somalis, adon. In all the different languages, they have a way of putting down dark-skinned people.
And when you lived in South Africa, did you experience that as well within the African tribes and within the African?
South Africa is the most perverted form of this, because it's coming out of apartheid. And
Yeah.
apartheid was set up, you have white communities, which is basically made up of the British and the Dutch and white people. Then you have what they call colored communities. The colored is the mixed person, or it would be an Indian or a Malay, because in Cape Town, most of the Muslims are from Malaysia, Indonesia, right? And then you have the African communities. So these three levels are three levels in society. The worst places are the African communities, the lowest form of education, the worst health services. Next level is the coloreds, and the Muslims fell into the colored area.
Yeah.
And the highest level is the whites. So the Muslims, the reason why I was asked to come with the Muslim Judicial Council to Cape Town is because apartheid was over, and one of the great leaders of the MJC, Sheikh Nazim Muhammad, he was a visionary, and I was giving some lectures in the country, and he said, look, we need somebody. Apartheid is over, but we all have these stereotypes and bias and racism. We need someone to help us to go into the African township and also to help us give dawah to the white people, because we can't do it. Every time we look at a white person, we lower our head.
Ajib.
When we go to the black community, we're afraid. And he said, you're the perfect person, because for us in America, it's not colored or African. It's just light skin or dark skin. All of us are African Americans.
Yeah.
So I have no problem dealing with dark skinned people, because that's what we come out of. I have no problem dealing with white people because I come from Boston, Massachusetts. I have no problem dealing with white people. I look them in the eye and tell them where to go. So I don't have a problem.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why I went there. So to make a long story short, this is a major challenge for the Muslim community to be able to recognize its prejudice and its bias bordering on racism. I'm not going to use the word racism, institutionalized racism. But we have to go into our whole concepts of intelligence, of beauty, our concepts of history, and to do a sort of rewriting, or re-understanding of our own Islamic history as well.
Last question, Dr. Abdullah. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Quick. Is, with a lot of young people right now are very much, the wave is anti-patriarchy, anti-misogyny, anti-imperialist, anti, and the rule book is, these liberal, woke, literature, basically. That's what you hear. How important is it, and what should we do to be able to instill confidence in our youth about Islam being able to offer a solution for the problems that everyone is facing?
Well, there was a writer in the 60s, his name was Frantz Fanon, and he wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth. And he was looking at the Algerian Revolution. He was from Martinique, he was from the Caribbean. And he analyzed revolutionary movements. And he said the first part of the revolutionary movement is to fight back. And it forms into a type of chaos and anarchy. But after a while, when the government starts killing people and chaos cannot sustain itself, people start organizing. And then now when you organize, you have to have an ideology. You have to have a direction, right? And so this leads you into the real revolution, which not only changes things on the ground, but it changes ideology, it changes way of life. It's a complete change. And I can say for our young people that in the 60s, I was involved in this revolutionary struggle of awareness in the 60s. And we reached the point of chaos and organizing, but we realized we need a way of life. And alhamdulillah, I accepted Islam, looking for that way of life, and I found it. We need a worldview. We need a system that can answer our questions, not only politically, but economically, socially, with our families, with our communities, in peace and in war. You need that type of all-inclusive ideology. And this is what Islam has to present. And that is why our young people need to realize we're holding on to a gem of wisdom. And many of the people who will come out of this anarchy that you see in front of you, they're going to be searching for something. And if Islam is understood properly by Muslims and presented to the people coming out of this anarchy, I believe there can be a new wave of Muslims coming in with a new revolutionary spirit that can actually enhance the Muslim community, not take away from it. It can give more energy to the Muslim community. So we have to realize now that we are the ultimate solution. And that's very important to understand, that this anarchy cannot sustain itself. What are your solutions? And Islam, I believe, and I've lived it, it is the ultimate solution. Many of the people coming out of the black struggle, I can remember some of my friends, they were carrying the red book of 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐿 in their pocket because they believed that, you know, socialism, communism was the answer. But then they found out that this is a godless society. This is a system, you know, which can even be worse than capitalism. And so they became in despair and then realized that what is left as an organized system is Islam. But the question is, who will practice Islam in its entirety? Who will understand their roots and understand what's going on in society in order to give the Islamic message with hikmah, with wisdom, putting things in the proper place?
Jazakallah khair. Any last projects? You mentioned a few of them. Any last projects and is there a reading list for Dr. Abdullah Hakim quick anywhere that people can go and see book recommendations or what have you?
Well, the only book that I can recommend, if you know, here, and not because it's mine, is that I have a book called Deeper Roots.
Yeah.
If you go to my website, HakimQuick.com.
Beautiful.
You go there, you can get the Deeper Roots, and then you'll see the skeleton of what I'm talking about. I'm in the process of expanding this book. This will give you the basis for that. For other information, stay tuned, because we'll be having, along with the Deeper Roots course, there's going to be a question and answer period. And one of the questions that naturally comes up is sources. So I will be going into the detailed sources, inshallah, with AlMaghrib Institute in our question and answer period for our course, our online course, Deeper Roots.
Excellent. Jazakumullah khair. Really appreciate your time, Dr. Quick. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you and preserve you always and your family. Stay safe over there in Toronto. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.